Justice for the
Right.
series. I'm attorney Gerald Griggs.
And I'm Kiandria Demone, and today we're giving you a sneak peek into the conversations that we'll be having on the show.
Earlier today, we were having a powerful conversation about justice, accountability, and families still looking for answers.
Right. So, Griggs, I want to ask you about something you posted earlier today because you stepped into my realm on the internet, right? So I know you're an attorney and I'm an activist, obviously, but I'm also a content creator and I'm kind of known for shaking the internet up. So when I see you feel the need to speak out about something, I know it has to be serious, right? You don't often jump into the ring with internet shenanigans, or you don't. I feel like if you say something about it online, then it's because it absolutely needs to be seen and addressed. So I wanted you to take a second to talk to us about this post that you made and why it was so important that you addressed it publicly like that.
Yeah, so, earlier today, I was just kind of going through some thoughts in my head. Georgia is about to have this huge governor's race. We all saw what happened over in Texas. And I thought it was time to have a real politically mature conversation. So I put this post up. And you're right, I don't typically get involved in internet back and forth. Sometimes I may get involved, but not as much. But with this case, I thought it was time to have a real honest conversation about cases that have happened in Georgia, cases where families have not gotten justice. And this is just a preview of what we're going to be talking about in the Justice for series, because I think a lot of these cases get swept under the rug and are not given the appropriate attention necessary. So, with the backdrop of us launching the podcast and a gubernatorial race in Georgia, I thought it was time to have a real conversation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let me ask you this. Well, let me say this. A lot of these cases, I realize a lot of people might not know about, or it's not at the forefront of their mind anymore. Because a lot of these cases that we're going to be talking about, I even realized myself, like, hey, life was so chaotic at the time, kind of how it is now. You know how there's so much going on, it's hard to keep up with what's going on. So a lot of these cases unfortunately happened when the world was turned upside down. So a lot of people either didn't hear about it, don't know the details, or it's just not something that's a pressing issue to them right now. So I want to talk a little bit more about that too.
Absolutely. And I think many of these cases happened during the previous first iteration of the orange guy. And so it was so much going on that it might have got lost. It may not have been one of the bigger cases. But then again, we were all stuck in a situation where we were fighting with issues that were happening at home as far as providing for food for our families, and of course, Corona. And then, of course, there was a rash of police involved killings that happened from 2014 to 2020. So we're going to talk about some of these cases that I decided to post about in Georgia, and we're going to start with one, and that's the case of Datrick Griffin. Datrick Griffin was an 18-year-old. He was shot by Atlanta police back on January the 15th, 2019. Now, Datrick was approached he approached an unmarked Atlanta police SUV that was parked at a gas station. This happened right around Whitehall Street. And those who are familiar with Atlanta, Whitehall Street is very close to Mercedes-Benz Stadium and the AUC. So he was over there at the gas station. There was an unmarked police SUV. The police SUV belonged to Officer Oliver Sidmans, who was an off-duty plainclothes officer. Griffin got into the vehicle, according to witnesses, and began to drive away. Officer Sidman fired his service weapon into the SUV. Griffin drove a short distance away before crashing, was found dead inside the vehicle. He was unarmed. This is one of those cases where in Atlanta we didn't hear a lot about it, but it happened about 2 weeks before the Super Bowl. Ultimately, Griffin's family were up in arms. They were calling for action, and they filed a lawsuit. So in 2019, the family filed a $5 million lawsuit against the city of Atlanta and the officer. The lawsuit argued that the teen should not have been shot over an alleged vehicle theft, especially when he was unarmed. Now, some time passed between 2019 and 2023. Ultimately, because of protests in other cases and this case, The officer was indeed charged. He was charged with felony murder and other charges, but in 2023, a jury found him not guilty of all charges. Also, there was a civil settlement with the city also in 2023. The city council of the city of Atlanta unanimously approved a $1.4 million settlement with the family of Datrick Griffin. The settlement resolved the civil case while the officer had already been acquitted in criminal court. Now, this leads us to a real conversation with this particular case about the use of deadly force in property crimes. And Kiandria, I want to talk with you. What did you think when you first heard about this case?
When I first heard about this case, honestly, it the first question I had was why a use of deadly force was necessary, obviously, but where my mind goes as the mom of a teenager, which obviously my son is not involved in that sort of activity, but it made me start thinking as a mom about the over policing of our teens. And I have seen it even here recently with all the takeovers that are happening. I personally, do I feel like they need to make sure people are safe? Yes. Do I feel like police have a job to do? Yes. But also, is that level of force necessary? And I've been seeing here recently what I feel like is a lot of over policing of children. And it makes me wonder, would it have been the same if it was a white child? And where is the in between? So for me, especially like I said, as a mom and as an activist, I don't feel like we should be putting people at risk, right? We shouldn't just let people run amok and commit crimes and harm people. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that the police have a job and a duty to de-escalate. And I feel like they are failing to de-escalate. That's my concern. When I hear cases like this, was he doing something he shouldn't have been? Where was he somewhere that he should not have been? Yes, but I feel like the officer should be trained to de-escalate that without killing somebody.
I definitely agree with you. And I'm glad you brought up the takeovers because that's the first thing that I thought of when I hear about the police's response to these takeovers, the public's response to these takeovers. And it fits right into this type of narrative. With Datrick, many of the critics who say justice was not served simply say, well, Datrick was an 18-year-old. Deadly force should not be used on an alleged vehicle theft. And of course, in Georgia, it's against the law to use deadly force to protect property, and shooting into a moving vehicle. Juxtapose that with these takeovers, there is going to be a high police rate of encounter with young people. Many times the young people don't have anything else to do, and now they're placed in situations where they're being over policed. So I agree with you that in this case and in those cases, we need to rethink how we de-escalate, how we respond to young people who are just trying to, with the takeovers, trying to have something to do on the weekends. They used to have the teen clubs. They don't have the teen clubs anymore. Now there are not a lot of places where teens can hang out and just be teens. I mean, we all remember we used to hang out at the mall. You didn't have curfews at the mall back
Right.
then. Now, I know a lot of people push back, well, certain activities occurring that didn't happen in the past, but I think that we need to provide venues for the teens, like midnight basketball and some of the other things that are happening to give them something to pour their energy into. You're about to say something.
Well, honestly, I was thinking about what you were saying. So I was just kind of processing what you were saying. And I'm also I'm thinking about community response, right? Like how the community acted in that moment. Now, if I'm honest, this is around a time where, like I said, the world was turned upside down for me. So I wasn't present in the activism back then. I wasn't in the protests and things. But me thinking now about some of the details you've given, I'm just kind of like, you know, I'm just wondering where our thoughts are and where our priorities are as a community and what that looked like for this case, because you mentioned the Super Bowl. And I don't feel like we can skate past that, the Super Bowl, because I remember the Super Bowl. I don't remember this. Isn't that crazy that I remember the Super Bowl, but I don't remember this case? Why is that? Heard a lot about the Super Bowl.
Well, I think in Atlanta, there's a belief that we don't have a police brutality problem. And this case, as well as the next case, kind of highlighted that. So, after Colin Kaepernick's protests started in 2016, we started to have a real conversation about police brutality and the deaths. But most of those cases were happening somewhere else. Now, there were other cases that happened in Atlanta, Oscar Kane and Kane Rogers and others that happened during that time, the 2016 time. But the time right here before the Super Bowl, Datrick Griffin, and then, of course, we'll get to Jimmy Atchison in a few minutes, there was a hush over the city to not talk about cases of police brutality, and then this case happened. So I think the response of the public was, we didn't know it happened. We didn't know Atlanta had a police brutality problem, and that's why the activists responded the way they did with that particular Super Bowl and moving forward as we moved into 2020 and the world was shut down, and then we saw what happened with the George Floyd protests and all those. So I think ultimately, to answer your question, what was happening was there was a media blackout on cases like this one and others, which is why you did not hear a lot about it.
See, but I would argue, or I would ask, how fair is that to citizens? At what point are we not putting more people at risk by addressing this problem? A problem like police brutality cannot be swept up under the rug. It's going to keep happening, especially when you have a lot of people coming into the city for an event or whatever that looks like, even if it's just people who live here. How fair is that? Like, I personally would not be happy with that. If I found out that something like that was going on in my area, there's a serious problem, a serious risk, maybe even in my area, because there's clearly a risk there, whether it was a person who was committing some sort of crime or an officer who I feel irresponsibly used deadly force. That is a problem that could affect other people. And at what point is it unethical to not disclose that to citizens? I feel like the media, I feel like elected officials, whether it's the mayor, governor, whoever, I feel like the police chief, everybody involved has a responsibility to do one thing, and that is to protect and serve citizens. So I feel like in cases like this, where there was a potential threat to so many people, and you did not disclose that for fear of whatever, I feel like that's unethical, and anybody involved has in turn failed those citizens and failed to do their job. That's how I feel. Now, everybody doesn't look at it that deeply or as extreme, but I look at it like that, because what's going to stop it from happening again? And then it's, oh, I didn't know. There are precautions you need to take, and they can't even take precautions if they don't know it's happening.
Absolutely. And that kind of transitions us into the next case, because as I said before, this case happened 2 weeks before the Super Bowl. This next case happened a few days before the Super Bowl, and that would be the case of Jimmy Atchison. Jimmy Atchison, on January the 22nd, 2019, in an Atlanta apartment complex in Allen Temple. He was 21 years old. He was a father. He was an aspiring rapper who had a very successful career on the West Side. What happened was he was in Allen Temple Apartments at his girlfriend's house when the federal task force, which included Atlanta police officers, were serving a warrant for armed robbery where he was a suspect. Members of the FBI task force, including Officer Sung Kim, went and attempted to arrest him. Jimmy was able to get out of his girlfriend's apartment, jump down 3 stories, and run around to the Candy Lady's house, where he was then hiding in a closet. As the federal task force surrounded the house, the apartment, and went into the apartment, they cornered Mr. Atchison as he was in the closet and gave him 2 conflicting commands, one to come out with your hands up, the other one don't move, and then he was shot right under his eye one time as he was exiting the closet. He was shot in his face. Now, this case caused a very big uproar in the community, because it was known to everyone on the west side of Atlanta what had happened. Key facts on this case: Jimmy was in fact unarmed. He was given conflicting reports, commands. One was don't move, and the other was to show your hands. And then Sung Kim, who was the officer who ultimately shot him, claimed that Jimmy made a sudden move towards him, making him believe that a gun might be present, and shot him under his eye. Now, from the point that this happened until the point that there was an indictment for felony murder, the family of Jimmy Atchison and activists protested over and over and over again. I was one of them, protesting at town halls, at city council, at sporting events, all to raise the awareness of the community in Atlanta that there was a shooting by a Atlanta police officer of a citizen who was unarmed. Now, many times, many people in the community didn't know, or the media didn't cover it, but because of the work of his family, his aunt, his mother, his sisters, and of course his dad, Jimmy Hill, this case made national media. It was also featured in BET Cop Watch and forced then Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms to account for this. Now, some of the things that happened in the timeline, 2022, after protest after protest, after going to the federal authorities as well as the district attorney's office and a district attorney election, Sung Kim was indicted for felony murder. He was granted bond after he turned himself in and was released on the same day with a $50,000 bond, and the case was set to go forward in Superior Court in Fulton County. Ultimately, Mr. Kim, through his lawyers, filed an action to remove the case to federal court, and a federal judge dismissed the charges against the officer, ruling that the officer acted in self-defense. This case is one of those seminal cases in Georgia and in Atlanta because it changed the rules on body cams for both Atlanta Police Department officers as well as federal officers, mandating that body cams must be worn by Atlanta police at all times as well as federal officers. And so it showed that some level of accountability must be had. But we got to kind of talk about why the rest of the country did not know about this case is because, coupled with Datrick Griffin and the close proximity to the Super Bowl, Atlanta did everything within its power to make sure that the world did not know what happened to Jimmy Atchison. So it worked for accountability for officers on the federal task force because now they have to wear body cams, but ultimately for Mr. Atchison's family, who still advocates on behalf of getting justice and reopening the case, it shows the shortcomings in the system. Kiandria, what did you think when you heard about this case?
So one of the things that I want to point out with this case is cases like this, though we don't, I mean, they're important to us. We talk about them, but this is not a big name case like the George Floyds or the Breonna Taylors, or not that they're not important, but it's just not the same level of energy behind it. But when I hear the details of the case, the thing that comes to mind to me is cases like these are landmark cases. That's what I would call is a landmark case because of the way it is still impacting us now. Like when it comes to body cam footage, that affects the way we deal with like ICE now, the killings that are still happening now. I feel like cases like these don't get enough, not just attention in the moment that they happen, but we don't sit to study and unpack how these affected us systematically going forward. And this is a case that's so important because, like you said, it changed the rules. Now we have to wear body cam. We have to wear body cams, right? So that's the first thing I thought about is like, wow, this is a case that is still impacting us now and people don't even realize it. This is a name that everybody's screaming, um, the Renee Goods or the Alex Pretty or whoever else's name you're screaming right now, you should at the very least know who this man is because he's one of the people who affected the current circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think that it underscores that here we are 7 years after Jimmy was killed by a federal task force officer.
And they're trying
It's
to.
mandated in at least Georgia that all federal officers wear body cams. Now, if we had a body cam in Renee Good's case, we had a body cam in Alex Pretty's case, we would have seen something different. And we would have also, if they had followed the rules and procedures that were outlined after Jimmy's case, both of those individuals would still be here. And so I think that's why it's incumbent upon us to know the name of Jimmy Atchison, but I think it's also incumbent upon us to know that he's not only affecting the change that we see in policy in Georgia, but he also should be affecting our conversation politically because
Yes.
these cases happened from 2019 to 2020 in Atlanta when a certain individual who's now running for governor was the mayor. And so it's incumbent upon us to have this robust, and which is the reason why I put the post up initially, to have this robust conversation about what police accountability looks like. You know, in the governor's race, you're not just going to be in charge of local law enforcement, you will be in charge of state level law enforcement like the GBI who does the police involved cases, but you will also have a relationship with federal officers and make the determination when a federal officer will come into your jurisdiction. So the governor will make the decision on when ICE is allowed to come into the state of Georgia, just like the
That's
mayor makes a decision on when ICE can come into the state of Georgia. And if we're not mandating body cams and de-escalation tactics, we're going to have more dead bodies at the hands of law enforcement.
And I think a lot of people see these cases as something that's in the past tense, or they were just a hashtag back then. Now that the Black Lives Matter movement, I wouldn't say it's over, but now that we're on the other side of that and people aren't still putting it in their bio, right? The trendiness has died down, for lack of a better term. Now that we're in this space, I feel like they don't realize how, again, these are still affecting us. They're still affecting us and they're going to continue to affect us. But what I see them as is not just cases, I see them as a blueprint. And you mentioned that earlier. Hey, there were a lot of rules that were outlined. Hey, there were a lot of things that changed in his case that if they had been followed over here, maybe those individuals will still be here. And I think when it comes to a governor or anybody in leadership, we have to also look at their track record when it comes to things like this, because that's just me personally. I'm like, if they behaved this way in this circumstance, things are way more escalated, I would argue, now. And I didn't think they could get worse, but Lord, somehow they have gotten worse. So, what is this individual going to do in a position of authority now? Like you said, if they're the one who decides, hey, ICE can come in, what does that look like for somebody who didn't necessarily handle the Black Lives Matter movement or all those police killings back then? If they didn't handle them to satisfaction of the citizens who they were serving at the time. And I feel like there's a disconnect. Like I was asking you that earlier, like why are people not asking that? Why are they not looking at that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because people are still kind of grappling with this second iteration of confusion about what's happening politically at the national level and not focusing so much on local and state level politics. And that allows us to transition to our next case, which is the Edward Barnett case on November the 9th, 2020, around Cortlandt Street at the Life Atlanta nightclub area. 28-year-old Edward Barnett was at the nightclub. At about 1:40 a.m., an Atlanta police officer who was off duty working security job witnessed what he purported to be gunshots and gunfire between multiple individuals in vehicles. The officer issued verbal commands and fired his weapon during the incident, and Mr. Barnett III was shot and died at the scene. It's important that during the course of the investigation, it was determined that there were multiple weapons recovered, but there was no weapon on Mr. Barnett. The multiple weapons were recovered, suspected drugs, cash, and several individuals were involved in the gunfire. 2 individuals were taken to the hospital with gunshot wounds. Criminal charges were pressed against 2 individuals for murder, but were changed to felony murder and aggravated assault. But the issue that most of the critics had for this issue was off-duty police officers working private security jobs and police intervention during active gunfights that may cause chaotic situations that injure somebody completely unrelated. And so that's why this particular case was so questioned by citizens. And of course, it didn't receive even close to the amount of attention those other 2 cases got, and they didn't get that much attention either. So, Kiandria, when you hear a case like this, what does it make you think? What do you think the issues were?
So the first thing to me, I am bothered by the off duty, off duty, off duty, off duty. How often are these things happening? these killings that are essentially police killings, but they're off duty. Like, the first thing that I think is, okay, so at what point do they clock out? Like, does being a cop give you blanket authority at all hours of the day and you could just pull out your gun and join a club fight? That's insane. I don't know. I'm not a cop. I don't know a lot about a cop, but about being a cop, but I don't think that it works that way. Like, at what point are they, you know what I mean? Like, at what point is it time for them to clock out? Like, I just am bothered by the amount of off-duty police killings that we're seeing in these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings to mind one of the newer cases, the Linton Blackwell case, where the same thing happened. But you're correct. You know, when a police officer is working in an off-duty capacity, it's incumbent upon him to maintain the safety of all the people in the establishment that he's supposed to be providing security for. If there's an active shootout, he should call for the other on duty officers and ultimately the SWAT team to actually deal with an active shooting that may be occurring in a different capacity than him in his off-duty job. And in this case, just going outside and joining in the firefight could leave not only Mr. Barnett dead, but other individuals dead. And the biggest question I have for this case is the only people that were charged with the shooting were some of the other people and not the person that shot and killed
That
Mr. Barnett.
killed him.
So this case, I've always struggled with, one, the fact that it didn't get media attention at all. And it was another line of cases during this period of time in Atlanta where it seems as though things were just swept under the rug like it was business as usual. Which leads us to the biggest case that Atlanta had at the time, the one that really did blow the lid off of Atlanta as this place where we don't have, allegedly don't have police involved cases. This is Rayshard Brooks. Rayshard was, and let me go to the details. Rayshard, on June the 12th, 2020, Rayshard was in a Wendy's parking lot on University Avenue. He was 27 years old. He was a father. He was a committed boyfriend. He was a son of Atlanta, and he was killed by police officers in the Wendy's parking lot. Here's what happened. Rayshard was in the Wendy's parking lot, and he had fallen asleep, and he was blocking the drive-thru, and this is all caught on video. The officer spoke with Brooks for about 40 minutes or so, asked him to do a field sobriety evaluation. He failed the field sobriety evaluation, and when officers attempted to arrest him, Brooks resisted, grabbed a taser, broke away from the officers after struggling with them for a little while, ran away from them, fired the taser upward towards Officer Garrett Rolfe, who then shot him twice in the back. The reason this particular case got the attention of the cases that we had all known about, namely Breonna and George Floyd, is because this case happened about 2 weeks after we all saw the viral video of George Floyd. This case was live streamed, and the video, well, not live streamed, but the video went viral, and it blew the top off Atlanta in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. Many of the seasoned activists had already been protesting for George Floyd. We had seen the families from Atlanta start to raise awareness that there were other cases in Atlanta. The powers that be in Atlanta, of course, were still denying that Atlanta had a police brutality problem. And then we all saw what happened in the parking lot. Of course, Rayshard ultimately died because of the 2 shots to the back. The then sitting district attorney charged both officers instantaneously, and then there was a complete uproar. There was protests. The Wendy's got burned. There were more protests in other parts of Atlanta. And finally, there was a conversation about police accountability in Atlanta in a way that the nation got involved. The incident was caught on body cam. It was caught on Wendy's security footage. It was caught on cell phone. This particular shooting was seen everywhere. Garrett Rolfe was charged with murder. Devin Brosnan was also charged with murder. But ultimately in 2022, the charges were dropped when the allegations against the then sitting district attorney for doing this for political matters, and it got appointed to the prosecuting counsel of Georgia, who ultimately dropped the charges. The political impact, and I'm gonna point you back to the Jimmy Atchison case. In the Jimmy Atchison case, you had Chief Shields, who had promised Atlanta that there would never be another situation like Jimmy Atchison. With the fallout of Rayshard Brooks, was asked to and did resign the next day. Protests erupted nationwide, ultimately leading into the anthem that was the anthem for 2020 by Lil Baby. You can see the video online circulating, and actually at I believe it was the Grammys, the Wendy's was set on fire at the Grammys, and then the Wendy's location became an autonomous zone where protesters were protesting days on end until ultimately there was another shooting of Sequoia Turner that dealt with citizen on citizen violence that ultimately caused people to call for changes in local government here in Atlanta. Update, Garrett Rolfe was ultimately exonerated, charges dropped on the murder charges, but ultimately was rearrested for an incident that occurred at a bar where he allegedly assaulted another civilian. So this case really blew the top off of Atlanta in a way of police brutality where the world saw what was happening and what people had been saying for years. Kiandria, what did you think when you heard about Rayshard Brooks' case?
So the first thing I will say is that to say Atlanta doesn't have a police brutality problem is disingenuous. The United States has a police brutality problem. So I wouldn't trust anybody now, then, or in the future. I wouldn't trust anybody trying to convince us that there's not a police brutality problem anywhere in this country, because the police force as an institution is fundamentally flawed in this country. We have a police brutality problem. So I wouldn't trust anybody trying to convince me of that personally. But the second thing that comes to mind is, do you notice a pattern with these cases? The ones where there's even an ounce of accountability, the ones where we at least fight it a little bit, there's always some sort of camera footage, where there's body cam, cell phone. Those are the ones where we're like, maybe that officer acted questionably, right? Why is it that the only ones where the officers were misbehaving or irresponsible happen to be caught on camera? I don't believe that. I wonder, if they're doing all this on camera, what the hell are they doing when nobody's looking? What is actually happening in these cases where there is no camera footage and they got off scot-free? It makes me wonder what really happened.
Absolutely. And I think this case, as opposed to all of the others, finally got Atlanta to the point in the national media where they would actually cover these cases. I can remember protesting for so many cases before Rayshard where we would actually march right past CNN and they would cover something else. But after Rayshard's case, and it was our hope that justice would come for Rayshard's family, ultimately the criminal justice system did not provide justice for his family, but the family did receive a civil settlement, and we're going to get into those in a few minutes. But there was no semblance of justice. And I think that, to answer your question, we have a serious issue with policing in America.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's beyond dispute at this point. We literally saw a man choked to death for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and then folks tried to justify it, but ultimately a jury convicted that particular police officer and other police officers, both in federal court and in state court. But here in Georgia, here in Atlanta, there still seems to be this uneasy combination of injustice. And you're completely correct that the only cases we even get close to getting accountability are the cases where there is either cell phone footage, body cam footage, or some type of surveillance camera footage. And that brings me to one of the most concerning things that many people aren't talking about, and that's the bill that's matriculating through the Gold Dome that would now ban the release of body cam footage in Atlanta
Mm.
because somebody was caught in a death and they don't want to put the family through the trauma of witnessing the death online. I believe it's House Bill 1223 for those that want to research it. But I think it goes to Kiandra's point. If we don't have the cell phone footage, if we don't have the body cam footage, we're going to go back to the days pre-Rayshard where Atlanta police and other police entities in Georgia will be able to say, oh, there's no police brutality problem. We don't have any evidence of any of that. And we can go back to business as usual. And I think people need to understand that the rules in these cases are very difficult to deal with in the first place. You know, the legal standard in any police involved case is the Graham versus Connor, uh, the Graham versus Connor standard, which is the reasonable officer standard. And courts have evaluated the use of force under this particular standard. It says, and there's a high prosecutorial burden. The prosecutor must disprove that the officer was not in unreasonable fear, and that the force was clear. The force was not clearly justified. And many times, just like in Rayshard's case, just like in Jimmy's case, just like in Datrick Griffin's case, where there was no criminal convictions, the prosecution is not able to clear that standard, and thus nobody's being held accountable. And that leads us to the only way you typically can meet that standard is by video footage where the jury can clearly see that the actions of the officer were clearly unjustified and his fear was clearly unreasonable. Namely, I'll give you an example. Somebody running away from you with a non-lethal weapon that is fired over your head and you shoot him in the back twice. Now, according to certain prosecutors, that was not clearly unjustifiable and the officer's fear might have been reasonable. That's why we got to have body cams. That's why we got to have these conversations about these cases. And that's the only way we rebuild community trust. Kiandra, what do you think is the necessary step to even get to a point where the community would rebuild that trust?
With the police force,
Yes.
a necessary step to rebuild the trust with the police force. If I'm honest, I have to be honest as an activist. I feel like a lot of it will have to be completely dismantled and it'll have to look completely different. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any cops, because obviously nobody wants to live in a world where there's no sort of authority or cops. Because, I've had situations where cops have actually come and helped me and I've been grateful for them in that moment. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't exist. I think that a lot of the system itself is going to have to be dismantled and changed and rewritten. And I don't think that's going to happen just with the police force. I think that there are other parts of our system that are enabling them. And I think that those parts of our system are going to have to change first, if I'm honest.
No,
And
and I agree with you. I think that we have to reimagine what public safety, and that's why I don't use the term policing. I use public safety because as an officer of the court, I'm concerned about the level of uneasiness, mistrust, downright disdain that many members of the community have for the current iteration of our justice system. And so I think that we got to reimagine what that looks like. I think we got to demilitarize many of these police forces. I think we have to de-escalate. They should stop asking the citizens to be the one to de-escalate. It should be the police to de-escalate. And some folk got to go to prison.
yeah,
I think that ultimately, when you start sending people to prison for violating the public trust, all of this stuff stops.
I was just about to say that. That's absolutely when you say, hey, if there was ever a way to earn any sort of trust from, because right now I think the trust is just gone. I don't think there's any at all. It's not even distrust, it is outright fear.
Yeah.
So first we got to erase that fear that's there before we could ever even form any sort of trust. But I think the first step is going to be accountability. Leave the body cam footage there. They are humans. We are all humans. We're all fundamentally flawed. There are going to be people who mess up. There are going to be people who break the rules. Hold those people accountable. Stop sweeping it under the rug. Stop making excuses. If this officer acted unjustly, stop making excuses. Send him to jail.
Absolutely. And so, for everybody watching, this was just a preview. This is what we're going to get into on Justice for podcast, the series, because a lot of these cases you didn't know anything about, except for maybe Rayshard's case.
No, I didn't.
Um, and it's incumbent upon us to have a real conversation, to dig deep into the evidence, to get to the bottom of what's happening and bring you an honest assessment of what it's going to take to get to the point where there's justice for these cases. And so I'm excited about this. As you can tell, I'm excited about my co-host. She is fabulous. She's a great activist. She's a disruptor, all the things that I want to be. I just love this, and I think this episode is just the beginning. Kiandria, what the last words you have on this opening episode of Justice for Us? Justice for.
So one of my biggest hope right now with this podcast and with linking up with you and everybody who's involved is that what we can do differently is to provide solutions. What I'm tired of, and I know a lot of other people are tired of, is feeling devastated, feeling scared, feeling afraid. I like that you're asking questions. Hey, what's the next step? How can we get there? How can we get there? I think everybody's wondering that. I want this to change, but how can we get there? So when it comes to police brutality, civil rights, or any sort of social justice issue, I'm hoping that this can be one of the first steps to mapping out, not complaining, not just talking. Let's map out how we get there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a lot of times on the internet and the podcast, we're talking a lot. And it's good to talk, but we got to get to the solutions. And that's one of the things we're going to do on this particular podcast is give the problem and then give the solution. But one of the things I think that's the most important is these cases deserve to be told. These family stories deserve to be heard, and we're going to uplift that on this platform. So everybody who has not subscribed or followed this particular channel or both of us, please log in, click in, subscribe, and we're going to have these conversations. We're going to delve deep into the most important cases of the day and then the ones you haven't heard, because every story deserves to be heard. Every voice deserves justice, and that's the purpose of Justice for the podcast series. So I'm honored to be with you. We're going to stay with you, and we're going to bring justice and accountability and solutions. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Again, like, comment, subscribe. Hey, if it's a case that we don't know about, put it down in the comments. Let us know so that we can talk about that case and elevate that case. And if you don't know about Jimmy's case, you don't know about Datrick's case, you didn't know about Edward's case, and you didn't know about Rayshard's case, Google them. Let's have a conversation in the comments because they all deserve justice. I'm attorney Gerald Griggs, a justice fighter. It's been a pleasure having a conversation with you. Kiandria, lead us out.
Okay, I'm Kiandria Demone. I am an activist, and I am so happy to be a part of this series. Now, I want you guys to, y'all know what I do is social media, right? And I will talk to y'all. So shoot me a DM, hop in my comments. Don't be weird about it, but hop in my comments if there is anything that you feel like we should be talking about, or if there are questions that you have. And I know a lot of y'all are a little bit shy, especially the non-Black people. You might be shy to ask the questions that you have been wondering this entire time. We're open to questions. We're open to questions. What I ask is that you do your research before you hop in and ask questions. Do the bare minimum, like he said, Google, then shoot us a question, and we're happy to talk. And we will see you guys next time.